Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by staff writer Joe Greeny to help me break down our mid-year report on election-related legislation. Joe, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Victoria. Super glad to be here.
Super excited to have you and to go over this. I know we did this last year, so it's fun to see how this year is shaping up. And listeners that want to dig in through the report themselves can find it in our show notes. It's filled with lots of insightful information. So, Joe, thanks to you and your team for putting this together. To start, what jumped out to me right away, looking through the report myself, we've tracked 3,735 election-related bills so far this year, which is more than what we tracked in 2023, like the total number. So can the increase in election-related legislation be explained by this simply being a big election year, or are there a bunch of factors that contributed to what we're seeing?
Yeah, I think the short answer is there are a bunch of factors, but the election year does play a part here. I think part of this is just Ballotpedia getting even better at tracking election legislation. So it's sort of just a methodological improvement on our part. We're getting better at making sure we don't miss anything in any state legislature that will impact elections. So that's part of it. We're getting better at catching things that in the past we hadn't, but we've always been able to get the big stuff, I should say, just for the record. And then, yeah, the election year does have something to do with it as well. I would consider a lot of the legislation introduced. The election year effect is more of a messaging effect. And it's just sort of the part of the nature of how legislation works, specifically election legislation. Most election legislation adopted in a year does not take effect immediately. It takes effect at some point in the future. So it's not like the bills and changes that we're seeing state legislators consider this year are about changing this year's election. They're more about proposing changes in the future, and even more so about allowing parties in specific states to run on platforms, election policy platforms, how they're planning to change elections. So yeah, it's more of a messaging effect than it is an actual policy change in an election year. And then we've also got just one other thing to mention as well is it's an even year, and there are 4 states that don't hold even year sessions, so it kind of makes that bigger number even more interesting. And one of those 4 states that don't hold even year sessions is Texas, which I know you're familiar with from the ballot side, Victoria, but they're good for a couple hundred election bills a year. So it is definitely an interesting uptick in election bills, and interested to see what happens with that number next year.
For the third consecutive year, states with Democratic trifectas have considered more changes to election laws than those with Republican trifectas or divided governments. So what do you think are the key reasons behind this trend?
I think there's a little bit more, I don't know, maybe message discipline is not the right term for it, but there's a little bit more of an agreement across Republican states, across the broad cohort of Republican lawmakers, and then amongst states with Republican trifecta, states where Republicans control the legislature. There's just a broader agreement about what sort of changes those lawmakers in those states are looking to make. And then I think on the other side is there's sort of a huge appetite amongst Democratic lawmakers in Democratic states to make any sort of change, and not any sort of change, but there's interest in a sort of broad range of changes, but less agreement about what specific changes are needed. And I think that goes all the way back to sort of political leadership in both national political leadership of both parties. There is a lot more sentiment on the Republican side about specific election-related issues they'd like to see changed than there is on the Democratic side. But there's a huge recognition on the Democratic side. Lawmakers should not be complacent. They're more responding to Republican initiatives to change election laws as well. So I kind of see the impulse coming from the Republican side, Democrats responding. Democrats have their own set of priorities, but they're a little bit less the same across the board. It's not quite the right way to look at it, but I think it does the trick for the purpose of this conversation.
Trifecta status just generally seems to play a big role. We could see how having control over the 3 major branches of government in any given state helps advance the controlling party's agenda. So what types of new laws did Republican and Democratic trifectas adopt?
Sure. Republican-led states this year, I would say both parties broadly talked about changes to election laws this year at the state level from a sort of trust in elections, security in elections perspective. I think on the Democratic side, it's much more trust in elections. On the Republican side, there's sort of that language is present, trust in elections, but it's more about election security, election integrity. So there's sort of a shared space there. But the actual policy changes are quite different. On the Republican side, we've seen a lot of bills, for example, adding new definitions for who may return another voter's absentee or mail-in ballot, ranked choice voting, which we just mentioned. We've seen a number of Republican states this year, Republican-led states, adopt bans on ranked choice voting, and all the 5 states that did so this year. All 5 are preemptive bans. So ranked choice voting was not in effect in any of those states. So we saw 5 states preemptively ban ranked choice voting. Which is an interesting sort of pattern there. And then we saw sort of other changes around voter registration administration, a lot of voter list maintenance stuff on the Republican side, trying to stand up new data sharing practices. And we also saw sort of restrictions on voter registration drives have been a common topic the last couple of years. A lot of similar bills introduced on that topic this year. Only really one that was adopted, and that was in Tennessee. But that's something I think we're going to see a little bit more of. Sort of the idea of removing third parties from the elections process, whether that be part of the voter registration process, part of the absentee mail-in ballot voting process. We've seen Republican states basically try and narrow down the interactions there to the voter and election officials, and sort of try to remove third parties from that process. And then on the Democratic side, I think the focus has been on, again, trust in elections. So new cure provisions, for example, making sure voters have an opportunity to correct a ballot with a curable deficiency that's usually referring to absentee mail-in ballots, but making sure eligible voters' ballots are not thrown out. And then we've also seen new definitions and penalties for voter suppression. That was a big part of Minnesota's new Voting Rights Act. That's just the language that they use for the bill. I should add. And then also bills around election mis and disinformation. Maryland passed an interesting bill related to mis and disinformation, and a couple other states considered similar legislation. And then just one thing, I know I already threw a lot at you there, but one more thing that I think is interesting is, and it kind of ties into the your last question about Republican states adopting legislation at a faster rate, is that sort of contrary to what I think most observers would think, bipartisan legislation really is the most successful legislation in terms of rate of adoption. Bipartisan legislation for the 3rd year in a row, again, has been adopted at a higher rate than partisan-sponsored legislation, whether Democratic or Republican-sponsored. There's a much smaller number overall of bipartisan bills. So yeah, there's still sort of more partisan legislation being adopted, but I do think it's interesting to note that bipartisan legislation, in terms of bill sponsorship, is the most likely election-related legislation to be adopted.
What other trends did we discover when it comes to the types of laws being proposed and passed? Any stand out to you, Joe?
Yeah, there were a few types of bills that garnered supporter attention across the partisan spectrum. A couple of topics that states of different trifecta statuses adopted new laws around. I think an interesting one is new laws related to presidential elections and presidential electors in particular. We saw a Democratic trifecta, a Republican trifecta, and a state with divided government all adopt laws related to what we call sort of the laws are titled Unfaithful Presidential Electors Acts, but it basically, what they are bills that govern the conduct of presidential electors and require presidential electors to vote for either their party's nominee or the winner of the election. So it's definitely a sort of post-2020. These laws were around before 2020, but just something that we've seen more interest in at the state level. Post-2020, another topic that saw attention from sort of states of different stripes were bills related to voting for individuals convicted of a felony or voting for incarcerated but eligible individuals. We saw 2 Republican trifecta states adopt new bills that more quickly restore voting rights to certain individuals convicted of a felony. Those are in Nebraska and Oklahoma. And just a fun fact about the Nebraska bill, that's LB 20. It was the first bill to become law in Nebraska without the governor's signature since 2001, so almost 25 years. And there is sort of a pending legal challenge there, but the bill actually did pass the legislature with bipartisan support. And then we saw 4 other states, again, Democratic trifecta, Republican trifecta, and 2 states of divided government, all pass bills related to voting by incarcerated but eligible voters, basically allowing those voters to either vote at a facility, a temporary facility established in a detention center, that's Colorado's new law, or allowing, just clarifying that eligible voters that are incarcerated for a misdemeanor or for an offense that isn't a disqualifying, that wouldn't be a disqualifying conviction, are allowed to request absentee mail-in ballots. And then voterless maintenance is really the one that sort of all states have paid a lot of attention to. This is one where on the surface, it's a topic that Democratic and Republican states are both working in and around, but they've got very different approaches. I think on the Democratic side, it's mostly join ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is a sort of multi-state voterless maintenance compact. It's sort of the original data sharing organization for states to try and maintain cleaner voter rolls using federal data, using other states' data. So there's sort of been, we've talked about this in other episodes, like keep it short, there's been an exodus from ERIC, mostly by Republican-led states for the last couple of years. So we've seen a couple Democratic states, including Hawaii, California, and New York, all pass bills. I should mention pass bills, but these bills have not become law yet. But they've passed bills either through a chamber or through 2 chambers that would require application to ERIC. And then we've seen a bunch of Republican states stand up new data sharing procedures as well, which is sort of the non-ERIC way to try and improve voterless maintenance, trying to bring in new data sources to compare against existing voter rolls. An interesting one there that was drew a bunch of attention earlier in the year is HB 1264 from Indiana, which allowed election officials to use third-party credit information, so data around the credit worthiness of the voter. They're obviously not looking at the actual credit worthiness of the voters, but they're using basically credit data that are aggregated by clearinghouses and businesses. HB 1264 allowed election officials to obtain that data and use address and personal information data from those sources for voterless maintenance activities. It's sort of an interesting one. We're seeing Republican states sort of move in that direction, looking for new sources. I'd say those are the big ones. There's a couple other topics that saw attention in multiple states, but those are, I think, probably the highlights. Sure. So the most active states by the number of new election laws have largely been Republican states. I think that's 8 of the top 10 states have been Republican trifecta states, and Tennessee and Georgia led the way there. In Tennessee, HB 2294 was a bill, and there's a Senate companion here. I'm not going to go through each bill number, but
let's zoom into a few states in particular. So Tennessee and Georgia, both Republican trifectas, were the most active states in passing new election laws. Maryland was the most active Democratic trifecta state. Can you provide a sampling of notable laws passed in these states for our listeners so they can get a sense of what we saw?
But this bill prohibits the pre-filing of information on voter registration applications. So this is sort of would be classified as a sort of new regulation on voter registration drives, new regulation on sort of third-party assistance for voter registration purposes. And then on to Georgia, they passed a number of bills that are sort of building off of a suite of changes to election law passed over the last couple of years. It's sort of an ongoing effort in Georgia to overhaul how elections work in the state. The big hitter this year in Georgia was SB 189, which is an omnibus elections bill. They did a bunch of stuff. Some of the notable things it did were remove the Secretary of State from the state election board, allow election officials to remove a voter from registration rules up to 45 days before an election, which is subject to litigation right now because there is a federal law that prohibits the removal of voters less than 90 days before an election. So there's news to come on that one. And the bill did a couple other things as well, including provide presidential ballot access to parties that have gained access in 20 other states. This actually would not impact RFK Jr.'s presidential candidacy, but it's sort of in that space. And then some other stuff that Georgia did this year. HB 974 is a new bill that requires watermarks on absentee ballots and actually establishes a pilot program to scan and publicly post images of ballots. It's sort of something we've seen on the Republican side as well, trying to generate a little bit more transparency into voted ballots. Bit of a controversial issue. Some folks would argue that it's a violation of privacy, but I think the impetus here is, again, to try and provide a little bit more transparency into the system. And the goal with this pilot project is to remove personally identifiable information, but to keep a record of voted ballots and make that publicly available. And then moving on to Maryland, which you also asked about, Victoria, they were the most active Democratic state this year, again, in terms of number of bills passed. And just to give a sense of the difference in scale here, Tennessee passed 36 bills this year, election-related bills. Georgia passed 33. Those are the two most active Republican states. Maryland, the most active Democratic state, passed just 10 bills. So we're talking about sort of a different order of magnitude here almost. Nevertheless, some big bills in Maryland. HB 333 is a bill related to election disinformation and misinformation. It provided new definitions in statute for both of those terms. And it also provided for a portal for the public to report instances of both election disinformation and misinformation, as well as a new system for potentially referring cases of mis and disinformation for prosecution. And then HB 585, which was titled the Protecting Election Officials Act, added new penalties for threatening election official or their immediate family member. This is another topic that has seen interest from states of all types, Republican, Democratic, trifectas, states of divided government. We've definitely seen multiple states look to add new protections or sort of bolster or expand existing protections for election officials and election workers. And I think we'll continue to see a bit more of that.
Very interesting. Let's jump into a divided government state, Virginia. Several topics like voter maintenance and protections for election officials, like you said, found bipartisan support. What does this tell you about areas of common ground in election legislation and how those negotiations might have played out in a state like Virginia?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm thinking, so back to the numbers, I think it might help to start there. So 25 new election laws in Virginia, sort of falling in between the most active Democratic states and the most active Republican states. But the most bills were also vetoed in Virginia this year. More bills were vetoed in Virginia, than in any other state this year. So Governor Glenn Youngkin vetoed 13 bills that passed both houses of the legislature or the assembly in Virginia. So we've seen some sort of agreement or ability to get work done in a couple areas, and then there were other areas that were sort of non-starters. And I think that's a fairly common situation for states with divided government right now. We're going to see a couple new laws and a couple of vetoes in each of those states. And just some of the stuff that they were actually able to come together on and get passed. Some of this we've already mentioned, a new bill related to voting for incarcerated individuals incarcerated, but eligible to vote. I think this is an interesting bill as well. HB 989 was a bill that requires the state's Department of Elections website to be translated into a number of languages, and also requires that that website provide a list of all candidates, constitutional amendments, and statewide referenda for each election in the state. So sort of a move towards making a state's elections department or just entity agency in charge of elections more of a resource for what's actually going to be on the ballot. Might be a little bit of competition for Ballotpedia, but we've always got our competitive advantage. I think that's something that we probably will see more of over the next couple of years. Just sort of the idea of getting more of that information directly from the state into the hands of the voters, or making it publicly accessible. So it's something to keep an eye on, see how that rollout goes in Virginia. And then as far as what was vetoed in Virginia, just a couple of highlights. SB 606, which was related to ERIC and voter list maintenance, that bill would have required Virginia to reapply to ERIC. They were a founding member of ERIC back in 2012, but resigned in 2023. And then HB 904 is a bill that would have required the Department of Elections to keep a record of cancellation of a voter's registration for 4 years instead of 2. Sort of, again, that idea where we've seen Democratic states or Democratic lawmakers, in this case, Democrats are in control of the Assembly in Virginia, Republicans control the governorship. Democratic lawmakers are looking to sort of put up roadblocks, obstacles for removing a voter from the voter rolls, or trying to make sure if somebody is removed, they have an opportunity to sort of correct or challenge that removal. So this is one where I think Governor Youngkin felt that 2 years for a record of cancellation was sufficient, where Democratic lawmakers were trying to bump that out.
Another really interesting point, kind of jumping off of what you were just talking about, was from the report was how many vetoes there have been in 2024. So far, there have been more in the first half of 2024 than in all of 2023, and more than in all of 2022. So to some of the points you just made, most vetoes happen in states with divided governments. Is there anything to make of that, or does it just kind of mirror what we've seen at the federal level, with opposing parties being selective when it comes to what they'll choose to step across the aisle to support?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I'm not sure I've got a great explanation for why there's been more vetoes this year than past years. Might be that election year effect that we talked about at the top a little bit, where there's sort of more messaging legislation that's being passed that might be actual policy non-starters for governors. And then just to put a hard number on it, so there's been 35 vetoes of election-related legislation so far this year, and all but 5 of those 35 vetoes came from states with divided government. So the vast majority of vetoes are in states with divided government, and really in just 3 states: Arizona, Wisconsin, and Virginia. Arizona and Wisconsin are 2 states with Democratic governors, where Republicans control the legislature. Virginia is the opposite. And then we also saw several bills enacted via veto override in Kentucky this year, new election bills. Kentucky was the only state that adopted new election laws through a veto override this year. Some of the new laws that were adopted over a veto override are new data sharing requirements, so voter list maintenance, topic keeps coming up, and also a ban on ranked choice voting.
So we're halfway through the year. Most state legislatures have wrapped up their sessions, but there are still 257 bills under consideration and a handful of states still in session. So are you looking out for anything in particular in the next few months leading up to the election in November?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, we are halfway through the year, but we're more than halfway through regular legislative sessions. There's always an opportunity for states to call special sessions. But as far as regular sessions go, we're past 2/3. Or I should rephrase that. More than 2/3 of states who will convene a legislative session this year have they already adjourned their regular sessions for the year. So the report touches on the bulk of election-related legislative activity in regular sessions for this year. But as you pointed out, there are still a number of outstanding bills in states that are still at work. That number you cited, 257 bills. There's actually 257 bills that have passed a chamber of a legislature. And I don't have a hard number. There's probably about 4 times that are still sort of active, alive bills, somewhere around 1,000 bills. But the expectation is not that that a huge number of those are going to end up becoming law. We've already seen the majority of bills that will become law. But we've got some big states that are still at work, notably New York and California. And when those states wrap up their regular sessions, we might see the numbers of newly enacted laws between Democratic trifectas and Republican trifectas even out a little bit. Both those states, California and New York, are considering a couple hundred election-related bills. Again, I don't expect a couple hundred bills to pass in each of the states, but we'll see some new laws in each of the states that aren't factored into this report right now. And then I talked about Eric quite a bit, but there's some Eric bills hanging around. I will say there's a bill in Hawaii that I mentioned a little bit ago that's been sitting on Governor Green's desk for about 2 months now. And then both California and New York have Eric-related bills that have passed the chamber as well. So we're definitely going to see, and the Hawaii bill is likely to become law. I'm not going to venture to say on the California or New York bills, but all that to say, yes, there's still some sort of top-line, high-level and impactful changes to election policy coming this year. Like we discussed early on, most of these bills will not have an impact on November's election. The horizon is more on the year to 2 year timeline for when these changes will actually impact elections and folks voting. But yeah, we got our eyes on some more stuff coming down the pike.
Well, that's all the questions I have for this report, but can our listeners expect a final year-end report at the end of the year?
Great question, Victoria. Yes, they can. We will release so this is our second annual mid-year report. I think it's bigger and better than last year's, and the plan is to do the same with our year-end report as well. We will release a year-end report in December, which will sort of touch on a lot of this stuff as well. Because again, the goal of the year-end report is to give a summary of what happened in the year. So a lot of the stuff in this media report will be reflected there as well, but we'll make sure to add in anything else that happened between now and then that deserves attention. And the goal there as well is to pad out our analysis, bring in a couple new ways of looking at some of what's gone on this year as well, and sort of build on what we've got here in the mid-year report. And then also we'll be doing sort of ad hoc updates if anything important happens. Just keep an eye on Ballotpedia News, keep an eye on our election policy pages on ballotpedia.org, and you will get those updates there.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, Joe, and sharing all of this with us.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It's been fun.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election administration coverage at the links in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.